The day I got a job offer, Cindy, McCaslin's wife, announced she was pregnant. She gave me to move out or pay $10,000 a month for living expenses. I remember the way the sun hit my window that morning, like it was trying to tell me something big was coming, like the universe itself had paused for a breath just before dropping a bomb on my life. And I swear, for a second, it felt like nothing could ruin the day, because after years of rejection, emails, after watching friends climb ladders I couldn't even touch, I finally got it. The job offer. Not just any job, but the job. The one I used to dream about back when I was sleeping on my mom's couch and pretending I wasn't suffocating. And when that email came through, I laughed so loud I scared the cat off the kitchen counter. I called my mom. She cried. I called my brother. He yelled like I won a lottery. And then I sat down on the edge of my bed and just stared at the screen like it might vanish if I blinked too long, because it didn't feel real yet. Not until I signed it. Not until I walked into that building and breathed in the carpet and copier ink smell of my future. And I thought, maybe this was the start of me getting my life back. Maybe I was finally crawling out of the hole I fell into when Dad left and Mom got sick and I had to become the grown-up too early. And then my phone buzzed and I almost didn't pick up, but I did. And it was my cousin Rehan's wife Ariba calling me of all people. And I answered half smiling, thinking maybe she'd heard through the family grapevine. Maybe she was calling to say congratulations or even just to pass on a sweet message. But the second I heard her voice, sharp and shaking like something had cracked inside her, I knew this wasn't a celebration call. I asked if everything was okay, and she said she needed to talk urgently, and could I meet her alone, not at their house, but at the cafe near the lake. And I was confused but said okay. And the drive over was surreal, like I was floating, not because of the job but because of the tension in her voice. Something about the way she said my name, like it hurt to say it. And when I walked into the cafe and saw her sitting there, hunched forward, clutching her tea like it was the only thing holding her together, my stomach dropped and I sat down slowly, cautiously, asking what was going on. And she looked up at me, eyes red, lips trembling, and said she was pregnant. And I swear I blinked so hard I thought I misunderstood. I said congratulations, because what else do you say to something like that? And she laughed bitterly and said no, not like that, not happy, not planned, not his. And I froze. Because suddenly the world tilted sideways, and I was falling into a place I didn't want to be. And I asked, too quietly, whose is it then? Already dreading the answer, and she looked me straight in the eye, like she wanted to burn the truth into me, and she said, yours. And the air left my lungs. I actually felt my chest cave, because what the hell was she talking about? That was impossible. That was insane, and she just stared at me as if daring me to deny it. And all I could manage was, what? Because my brain was still flipping through memories trying to find some moment, some mistake, some drunken lapse in judgment. But there was nothing, there was absolutely nothing, except that night, 6 months ago, when she came to my apartment, crying, saying Rehan had hit her, and I let her sleep on my couch, and we talked all night about life, and loneliness, and shame, and we drank a little, not much, and somewhere between midnight and dawn we kissed. Just once. One confused, painful kiss that ended with both of us crying, and she left in the morning, and we never spoke of it again. And now she was telling me this. Now, on the very day my life was finally turning around, and I asked her why. Now, why today? And she said because she was done hiding, because she couldn't lie to Rehan anymore, and because she couldn't do this alone. And then she said the words that will haunt me forever. I'm giving you 2 options. And she laid them out so calmly it scared me. She said, either you tell him, and we deal with the fallout together, or I tell him you forced me. And my heart stopped, not skipped, stopped. Because what the actual hell was happening? What kind of twisted corner of the universe had I wandered into? And I stared at her like I didn't even know her anymore, like she was some stranger wearing her face. Because how could she say something like that? How could she even think of saying something like that? And she just kept sipping her tea like she hadn't just blown up my entire world. And I kept looking around the cafe, at the people laughing and typing and sipping coffee like nothing was wrong. Like my life wasn't teetering on the edge of destruction. And I wanted to scream, but all I could do was whisper, why would you do this? And she said, because I'm scared, and I don't know what else to do. And I said, that's not fair. And she said, life's not fair. And then she got up and walked out, just like that, left me sitting there with a cold cup of tea and a heart full of panic. And I don't even remember driving home. I just remember locking the door and sliding down to the floor, holding my phone and the job offer email and wondering how the best day of my life could also be the worst. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there in the dark with my head spinning and my hands shaking, trying to make sense of everything, trying to replay that night like a tape stuck on loop, over and over, searching for something I missed. Some gap in the memory where things blurred into something more than they were. But no matter how many times that kiss was the only thing that ever happened. It was awkward and desperate and ended almost immediately, and we never touched it. After that, not a word, not a look, not anything. So how could she say the baby was mine? How could she be so sure unless she wanted to believe it just to push me into a corner, unless it wasn't about the truth at all? and maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was about control, about fear, about her trying to latch onto something that would give her power in a life where she probably felt powerless. And I wanted to be angry at her. I wanted to hate her for putting me in this position, but part of me just felt hollow, like all my thoughts had turned to sand slipping through my fingers faster than I could grab them. And then came the fear, the real fear, the kind that grips your spine and whispers, "This is how everything ends." Because what if she really did it? What if she told Rehan I forced her? What if she cried and lied and played the victim, and I was left holding the guilt of something I never did? What if people believed her? What if the job offer disappeared before I ever set foot in the building? What if my mom saw my name on the news and my face in shame? What if every sacrifice I made was erased in an instant, and I knew I had to talk to her again? I had to fix this somehow before it got worse. So I texted her the next morning and said we needed to talk. And she replied with one word, "Soon," and that word haunted me all day. Through every fake smile, every distracted nod, every time someone in the family called to say how proud they were of me for finally landing something stable, and I wanted to scream the truth into the phone, to confess the chaos hiding under my congratulations. But I didn't, because what would I say? How would I even begin? And then, 2 nights later, she showed up outside my apartment without warning, standing in the rain like some ghost pulled from my conscience, and I let her in because what else could I do? And we stood there in the hallway, soaked and silent, until she finally spoke, and her voice was quieter this time, not angry, not threatening, just tired. And she said she didn't mean it. Not, really, that she didn't want to destroy me. She was just scared and confused and didn't know what to do. And she said Rehan had been distant lately, colder, and that the pregnancy had thrown him into some spiral she didn't understand, and that maybe deep down she wanted to drag me into it so she wouldn't feel so alone. And I said, "So it's not mine?" And she looked away and said, "I don't know." And that hurt more than any yes or no could have. Because now there was a crack in the floor under me, and I didn't know how deep it went. And I asked her if she was going to tell Rehan, and she said she didn't know that either. And I told her if she ever repeated what she said to me in that cafe about the 2 options, I would fight back with everything I had. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I couldn't let her destroy me like that. And she nodded like she understood. And for a moment we stood there in the hallway, both soaked and broken, just staring at the floor like the answer was carved into the tiles. And then she said, "I'm sorry." And I nodded, and she left. And the silence that followed was so loud I thought it might rip the walls open. And the next few days were a blur, like I was walking underwater, trying to hold on to reality with fingers that kept slipping. And then the call came. My new employer, confirming the orientation date, the relocation package, the housing stipend, the beginning of a new life, and I wanted to celebrate. I wanted to breathe again, but I felt like I was standing in the wreckage of a house I hadn't even noticed burning. And the worst part was, I didn't know if the fire was still smoldering under the floor, or if this was just the smoke trailing behind me, waiting to follow me wherever I went. And I kept thinking about Rehan, about the way we grew up like brothers, the way we fought and made up and protected each other from the messes our parents left behind. And I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if he ever found out, not just about the kiss, or the night she spent on my couch, but about the baby, about the doubt, about the possibility, however small, that his child might carry my blood. And I couldn't decide what was worse, that it might be true, or that it might not be, and she had said it anyway. And the thought kept eating at me, kept whispering, "You'll never be free of this." And maybe it was right. Maybe even with a new job in a new city and a clean slate, some stains don't wash out, they just follow you. And I knew I had to do something, to take control of the story before someone else wrote it for me. So I did the one thing I thought I'd never do. I called Rehan, and asked him to meet me. He sounded surprised when I called, not suspicious, just surprised in that way cousins do when you haven't spoken in a while, and then suddenly there's an urgency they can't place. But he agreed to meet without asking questions, told me to come over that evening, and the whole day felt like a countdown to execution. Like every tick of the clock was another reminder that I was about to walk into something irreversible, and I kept rehearsing the conversation in my head. How to say just enough without saying too much, how to be honest without setting the world on fire, how to protect myself without throwing a Reba under the bus completely. And when I pulled up to his house, my heart was thudding so hard I felt it in my neck, in my fingertips, and I sat in the car for a full 5 minutes before getting out, trying to calm my nerves, trying to remember the smell of fresh beginnings from the job offer email instead of the smoke of whatever was about to happen here. And when he opened the door, he looked tired, older than I remembered, like the past few months had worn him down from the inside out. And part of me wanted to hug him and tell him I was sorry for everything he didn't even know yet. But I just nodded and stepped inside, and we sat in the living room, like we used to when we were kids playing video games, only now there was this ocean of unspoken pain between us. And he said, "So, what's going on?" And I looked at him, really looked at him, at the cousin who taught me how to ride a bike, who bailed me out when I got caught stealing cigarettes at 13, who punched a guy in the face for calling me a loser in college. And I felt this ache in my chest, because I knew that no matter what I said, we wouldn't be the same after tonight. And I started slowly, told him I got a job offer, that I'd be moving out of the city in a few weeks, and he smiled, said he was proud of me, but I could see the curiosity flicker in his eyes, because he knew that wasn't why I came, and I told him there was something else, something difficult. And he leaned forward a little, like he was bracing himself, and I said, 6 months ago, Ariba came to my place, said you'd had a fight, and I watched his face harden, not with rage but with a quiet shame, and he looked down and nodded like he already knew what I was going to say, and I kept going, told him she stayed the night but nothing happened, not really, just a kiss. One kiss, confused, meaningless, born from hurt and alcohol and exhaustion, and I told him I was sorry, that I regretted it more than I could explain, and he sat there quietly, breathing slowly, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might crack his teeth, and then he asked, "Is that all?" And I almost said yes, almost let it end there, but the words caught in my throat, heavy and sharp, and I said, "She told me she's pregnant," and he blinked slowly, like he didn't quite register it, and then he whispered, "I know," and I felt the floor shift again, because I wasn't expecting that, and I asked him when he found out, and he said a few weeks ago, that she'd been distant and anxious and finally broke down crying. Told him she was scared it wasn't his, and my heart dropped into my stomach, because this meant she'd already planted the seed, already begun spinning the threads of this nightmare, and I asked him what he thought, and he laughed bitterly, said he didn't know, that he'd been trying to convince himself it didn't matter, that he loved her enough to raise the baby regardless, but then he looked at me and said, "Now, I don't know what to believe," and there it was, the fracture, the doubt, the poison, and I hated it, hated that I was part of this mess, that I'd brought it to his doorstep, and I told him again, more firmly this time, that I didn't sleep with her, that I didn't cross that line, not even close, and that if the baby wasn't his, it wasn't mine either, and he nodded slowly, rubbed his face with his hands, and said, "She told me you forced her," and I felt everything inside me freeze, like my blood turned to ice, and I just stared at him, not breathing, not blinking, and he looked up at me and said, "I didn't believe her, not really, but she said it so convincingly, and part of me, I don't know, part of me wanted to believe it, because it meant it wasn't her fault, that she was still who I thought she was, and I said, 'Do you think I'm capable of that?' And he didn't answer right away, and that silence was the worst thing I've ever felt, because in that moment, he didn't know, and I realized that no matter what I said, no matter what I swore on, the doubt was already there, already eating away at the edges of what we used to be, and he finally said, 'No, I don't think you're that person.' But it felt like too little, too late, like the damage had already been done, and he asked me why she would lie like that, and I said I didn't know, maybe fear, maybe desperation, maybe she was lashing out at the world and I was the easiest target, and he just nodded, like he'd already had that conversation in his head a dozen times, and then he said, 'She's leaving me,' and I felt the final piece fall into place, the collapse, the reason behind the threats, the lies, the manipulation, because she was trying to anchor herself to someone, anyone, and we were both just men caught in her hurricane, and I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there with him, two cousins staring at the same broken glass, wondering how it shattered, and eventually he said, 'Thanks for telling me,' and I nodded, and I left without another word, because there was nothing left to say, and when I got home, I packed a suitcase, not because I was leaving right then, but because I needed to feel like I still had some kind of control, like I could still choose something, and I didn't hear from Marie for days, until I got a message short, cold, final. I told him I lied, he's leaving, don't contact me again. When I read that message, I didn't feel relief. Not the kind you'd expect after someone finally admits the truth, and the weight starts to lift off your chest. No, what I felt was something closer to grief, not because I lost her, I never had her to begin with, but because something inside me had shifted permanently, like the foundation I'd built my sense of right and wrong on had cracked, and now everything felt a little uneven, a little off-kilter, and even though I was in the clear, even though her threat had fizzled out and the nightmare was technically over, I couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop wondering how close I came to having my life ruined, to being branded a monster, to being another story, whispered behind closed doors. And I kept thinking about all the men out there who didn't get the chance to tell their side, who didn't get a text message that cleared their name, and I thought about how he must have felt when she looked him in the eye and confessed she lied, and what that kind of betrayal must do to a man who spent his whole life trying to be enough, and it gutted me, because for all the pain she put me through, he got the worst of it, the hollow kind of pain that keeps echoing long after the sound dies out, and I didn't reach out to him, not right away. Because what could I say? Sorry, your wife used me as a scapegoat. Sorry, she threw both our names into a fire just to feel something. Sorry that the cousin you trusted became the face of your humiliation for a few days. No, there were no words good enough for that kind of damage. And so I focused on the one thing I still had left, the job, the one piece of my life that hadn't crumbled under the weight of the chaos, and I started preparing to move, to leave behind this place and the memories rotting in its corners. And I thought moving would be a clean break, a sharp line between then and now, but it wasn't. It was messy and emotional and filled with sleepless nights where I questioned everything. Questioned whether I was really free or if I was just running from the fallout. And a few nights before I left, I got a knock at the door. And when I opened it, it was Rihan, standing there with a face that looked like it had aged 10 years. And we just stared at each other for a moment, like two people meeting after a war, unsure of who came back and who didn't, and I invited him in, and he walked slowly, like he was carrying the weight of every silent thought he'd had since our last meeting, and he didn't say anything for a long time, just sat on the edge of the couch and looked around the apartment. At the boxers, the half-closed suitcase, the faint shadows of all the nights we'd shared stories in this room, and then he finally spoke and said, "I wanted to hate you." And I nodded because I understood, because I probably would have to, and he said, "I kept replaying everything she said, and everything you said, and it didn't make sense, but I didn't want it to make sense. I just wanted someone to blame." And I told him I knew that feeling well, and he said, "You're still leaving?" And I said, "Yeah," and he nodded, like he already knew the answer, and he said, "Good." And I almost laughed, not because it was funny but because it hurt. And I asked him what he was going to do now, and he shrugged and said he didn't know that the house felt empty and loud at the same time, that sometimes he still woke up thinking she was next to him. And then he said something that hit me harder than anything else. He said, "I thought you were the only thing in my life that was still real." And I didn't know what to do with that. Didn't know how to hold someone else's disappointment when my own hands were still bleeding from the wreckage. And I said, "I never wanted to be part of this." And he said, "I know." And then we sat there in silence, both of us nursing wounds we couldn't show. And when he stood up to leave, he hesitated, like he wanted to say more, and then he just said, "Good luck out there." And I said, "You too." And he left, and I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway. And that's when I realized that leaving wouldn't make me forget, that the story would come with me whether I liked it or not. Not just because of what happened, but because of who I became in the process. Someone who no longer believed that the people you love will always protect you. Someone who knew that one bad decision, even one you didn't fully make, could still follow you into every version of your future. And for the first time since the job offer came, I felt afraid of success. Afraid that no matter how high I climbed, there'd always be a version of me back here in this city, in this moment, stuck at the bottom, watching it all unravel. The morning I left for the new job, I woke up before my alarm, before the city even started to stir, and I stood at my window watching the sky fade from black to gray to a reluctant blue, thinking about how endings never really come clean, how they don't show up with fanfare or clarity, just slow, quiet closure that feels more like being uninvited than being released. And as I loaded my bags into the back of the car, I kept waiting for some sign that I was doing the right thing, a feeling of triumph maybe, or at least a final wave of certainty, but all I got was the weight in my chest that I'd been carrying. Since the moment Ariba said those words, "I'm pregnant. You have two options." And even though I told myself over and over that it was over, that she'd admitted the lie, and that Rihan knew the truth, and that I was finally free to step into the life I fought so hard for, I couldn't help but feel like I was still tangled in something I couldn't see. Like the smoke of that moment was still stuck in my clothes. And as I pulled out of the driveway and headed toward the highway, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Not because I looked different, but because I'd lost something I couldn't name. Maybe innocence, maybe blind trust, maybe the belief that doing the right thing was enough to protect you. And the drive was long and silent. No music, no distractions. Just mile after mile of me trying to untangle everything that had happened. Trying to forgive her, trying to forgive myself. Trying to make peace with a reality I never chose but was still forced to navigate. And every time I thought I could move on, her voice would echo in my head. That sharp, desperate tone when she said she was scared and didn't know what else to do. And I'd wonder if that was true, if she really was just lost and drowning in her own shame, or if she was always capable of cruelty that deep and calculated, and I hated that I didn't know. Hated that I could spend years knowing someone and still be left with a version of them I never saw coming, and it made me question everyone, everything. Every bond I once thought was bulletproof, and by the time I reached the city of my new job the air felt different but my heart didn't, because I was still carrying them with me. Rihan, Ariba, the betrayal, the silence, the damage, and when I walked into my new apartment, all shiny floors and blank walls, I felt like a ghost trying to pretend I was alive again, and I sat on the empty couch and opened my laptop to review the onboarding documents, and there it was, my name next to a title I worked years to earn, and I smiled, a weak, fractured smile, because this was supposed to be my moment, my start, but it already felt borrowed, tainted by the memory of what it cost to get here, and in the weeks that followed, I poured everything into work, long hours, no breaks, no calls home, just focus and performance and proving myself, because if I couldn't fix the past, at least I could control the present, and people started to notice, supervisors praising me, colleagues inviting me out, but I kept my distance, always afraid of getting too close, of trusting too soon. of building something on a foundation that might crack again. And one evening after work, I got a message from Rehan Short. Just a picture of an ultrasound and the words, "It's mine." And I stared at the screen for so long I forgot to breathe. And then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. Because after all that pain and destruction, after the accusations and the lies and the threats, it wasn't even mine to begin with, and the relief that should have come just didn't. Because it was too late. Because we were all too broken now. And I replied only with, "I hope you find peace." And he didn't reply, and I didn't expect him to. And after that, I deleted Ariba's number, archived the entire thread, put it somewhere I couldn't stumble across on accident, because some chapters don't need to be burned. They just need to be closed. And I started trying to live again. Really live. Letting people in one cautious smile at a time. Letting laughter come back in small cracks. And slowly, I stopped flinching when someone said my name too softly, or when my phone lit up unexpectedly. And I realized healing doesn't always look like forgetting. Sometimes it just looks like functioning, like standing up every day and deciding to keep going, even when the shadow of what almost happened follows you down every hallway. And if there's one thing I know now, really know, it's that even the best days of your life can be wrapped in nightmares. And even the worst people can wear the face of someone you once loved. And maybe that's the real lesson here. That the difference between a miracle and a mistake is sometimes just a moment of weakness. And what we do with the truth after that moment is what defines the rest of our lives. And I'm still defining mine, one breath at a time.